Hello everyone, today I want to give a lecture on the ethical theory of utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is what we call a consequentialist ethical theory, which means that it's an ethical theory that holds that the goodness or the rightness of our actions derives from the consequences of those actions. So utilitarianism as a consequentialist theory holds that the right action or the good action is the one that creates the most utility. Now, any utilitarian theory or any consequentialist theory for that matter is going to have to come up with a way of determining how we measure the consequences. So when we're measuring the consequences of our actions, there are two questions we have to ask ourselves. The first question is, who or what counts in our calculation? Because notice, I could come up with an ethical theory that says the right action is the one that leads to the best consequences for me. That would be the theory of ethical egoism. Now, the utilitarian will generally make the argument that the right action is the one that leads to the best consequences for everyone, or for everyone impacted by the action or involved in the action. So, if we're going to adopt a utilitarian ethical theory, we have to recognize that everybody else matters in our ethical calculations. Now then we get the difficult ethical question of, do animals count in that calculation? Some utilitarian thinkers argue that no, ethical behavior extends only to human beings. Others argue that yes, if animals can experience pleasure or pain, or maybe even happiness or suffering, then animals ought to count as well. But that is a debated ethical issue that a utilitarian could go either direction on. The second question we have to ask is, what are we measuring? In other words, what consequences are we trying to produce? The utilitarian argues that we want the consequences that produce the most utility. But not all utilitarians necessarily agree on what that is. Jeremy Bentham, oftentimes considered one of the founders of utilitarianism, at least in its modern form, argues that what we want to maximize is pleasure, and what we want to minimize is pain. So Jeremy Bentham argues that the right action is the one that leads to the greatest amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain for everyone involved. Now, another utilitarian, like John Stuart Mill, will argue that actually what we're interested in is maximizing happiness. His argument is that pleasure may be a good thing, but the most important thing that we care about is happiness, and that is not necessarily the same thing as pleasure. So for Mill, utilitarianism leads to what he calls the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness principle holds that the right action is the action that will lead to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number. So, in conclusion, utilitarianism is a consequentialist moral theory. As a consequentialist moral theory, it holds that the rightness or wrongness of our actions come from the consequences. If we're going to take Mill as our kind of paradigm utilitarian thinker, then the idea is the right action is the one that will lead to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people involved. So if you want to figure out if your action is right, ask yourself who will be impacted by the action. Will this action lead to happiness or suffering for that individual? Figure out all the results, and then the action that will lead to the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number will be the right action and the right thing to do.